sex?
What is gender?
Wait, aren't they the same thing?
The answer is no, but let's unpack it.
Gender matters! In our everyday lives, people often use sex and gender interchangeably, but psychologists and others have pushed us to see sex and gender as two distinct things.
For well over a century, women psychologists have challenged the idea that differences between men and women are biological. Instead, they emphasize the important role of different social environments experienced by people of all genders. In the 1970s, psychologists began distinguishing between sex as a biological state and gender as a sociocultural process.
Defining sex and gender in this way gave psychology a language for talking about differences without framing them as essential and unchanging. It also meant that we could study psychological topics either in terms of sex differences or in terms of gender differences.
So some researchers might study sex differences in pain by investigating the biological basis in pain perception in men versus women.
And a study of gender differences in pain would address how people of different genders experience and communicate pain differently, or how they're perceived differently by other people when they report being in pain, and what kind of real-world consequences these differences have. Do we take men's reports of being in pain more seriously than we do women's? And do these differences result in men and women receiving different medical treatment? So recent research actually suggests that it does.
But are sex and gender completely different things?
Not always. So we've been using a lot of binary language here because that's how sex and gender have so often been defined. And this history of thinking only in terms of male-female and man-woman continues to influence our social worlds, even though we now recognize that people experience sex and gender in a variety of different ways.
We often make a distinction between sex and gender, but the two can be intimately connected. Our world is full of ideas about what is appropriate for different genders.
Like our stereotypes about how people should experience emotion. We think of women as being more emotional than men, and it's more socially acceptable for people whom we perceive to be female to express emotion. Or the fact that we divide most of our clothing up as being for girls or boys, women or men, ignoring anyone who doesn't fit into these binary categories.
Exactly. Gender norms like these and so many others mean that the sex assigned to us at birth influences our social environment. This means that sex is a factor that has shaped many people's experience of gender.
Compared to gender, sex seems much more straightforward.
Even the idea of sex as either male or female is not clear-cut.
Yeah, what about people who are intersex or trans?
Exactly. Sex is usually assigned at birth based on observable physical characteristics. But is sex simply what is on the outside of our bodies?
Well, there are all kinds of internal, physiological, anatomical, and hormonal features associated with sex. And there is a ton of variation in these aspects of sex and in those external physical features that we associate with being either male or female.
Over time, we've come to recognize the variation that exists in both our biology and our psychology. So even though our world is often organized in terms of male-female distinctions, both sex and gender are non-binary. They're not either or. So it may be helpful to think about sex and gender in terms of an imperfect spectrum. Males may be at one end and females may be at the other, but there's all kinds of variation in between. Intersex, non-binary, genderqueer, trans, cisgender.
And even though it can be easy to talk about sex and gender as being along a spectrum, our society is often set up in binary terms, as either female or male, making life very hard for non-binary folks. And it's not just human beings that we put into these categories. We often think of objects in gendered terms too.
For instance, Bic released a line of pens specifically for her. Or you can buy Dove products specifically for men. Why? Is it because women can only use pink pens, or that men are unable to use other kinds of soap? And what about non-binary people? How are they supposed to get clean? These kinds of objects only become masculine or feminine when we put a label on them or market them specifically to men or women. But let's face it, a pen is just a pen and soap is just soap.
The influence of gender on the world around us is called gendering. Gendering takes place when ideas about femaleness and maleness are applied to individuals or even objects. This process influences how we see and understand our world. Gendering is something we do all the time without even noticing it.
So how about an example of gendering in science? The anthropologist Emily Martin has written about how society's ideas about masculinity and femininity have influenced how biologists study the reproductive process. Not only were sperm referred to as male and eggs as female, but they saw the reproductive process as being gendered. Male sperm were assumed to be active and female eggs were assumed to be passive.
This kind of gendering in biology might seem innocent enough, but it has important consequences. With this gendered mindset, biologists are unable to see the ways in which eggs are in fact active, even aggressive participants in reproduction, or how sperm can be passive. Only when we remove our gendered lenses do we see these features of reproduction.
We need to be aware of the difference between sex and gender, and of the diversity of sex and gender, and of the gendering that goes on all around us. Being aware of these things is a critical first step toward a more equitable gender science.
Thanks for checking out our video. Click the link below to explore the rest of the videos in this series.
Also take a look at Psychology's Feminist Voices website for more resources about feminism, gender, intersectionality, and psychology.
Remember, gender matters.